Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, my family, I would like to welcome you to this time. This time in which we discuss the world, what has happened, what is happening, and what may or may not come to pass. We have an expert, someone who knows a lot more than me about this shit. Codename Agent Smith. Let's talk to him. If you have questions, ask in the chat. Fuzzy Cord is going to pass those along to him for you. Let's rock and roll. If you donate, I can pass those along to him as well. I pay him a flat 50 every time. If you go above 50, then he gets that. So, let's rock and roll. Let's make some content. I'll be playing StarCraft during this session. We'll have some gameplay. In the background, it's not going to be quite as high quality play because I'm trying to listen to him and engage in conversation as well. But on that note, we begin in 3, 2, 1. Shaboom.
Agent Smith.
Hello?
What's up, dude?
Oh, hey. How are you doing?
Actually awesome. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Been kind of an up and down week.
Mm-hmm. What's the up? What's the down?
Well, you know, I did some house sitting, so that was nice. Did some research for the podcast. That was good. But then I also had food poisoning, so that was kind of down.
That's a little bit less pleasant. What did you eat?
I ate a pizza and cheese sticks.
Wow, how did that poison you? Was it old?
I don't think so. I ate it fresh, but I don't know. Maybe something with the ingredients.
Well, that's unfortunate. Pact's boss also got food poisoning, on Monday of last week. She was supposed to have a really big meeting and presentation, and she was super stressed because it was like, I didn't finish the document for tomorrow. Next morning, boss wakes up, food poisoning, everything is canceled. Yes!
Yeah, food poisoning will definitely put you in the mood to cancel things.
Yeah. My digestive system is working in the opposite direction. Please stand by.
Yeah, it'll definitely preoccupy you.
Yeah, so I moved into a new apartment.
Oh yeah, how did that go?
Well, it was heavy and hot, but we moved the stuff from one place to the other. It was moving from a second floor apartment up to a third floor apartment. And as the person who was the primary for picking the stuff up and moving it to the car and then back into the new place, you get a very intimate sense of the mass that you possess.
Yeah.
So we did it. I was basically like semi-wounded or injured for 3 days after that. Just like my ankles and knees were really worn down, all the cartilage and stuff. But we're fine. It's a good place. The only downside, so it's bigger for the positives. It's bigger. It's newer. We don't have upstairs neighbors, so we don't have the noise of them. The downside is we don't have fiber, even though there's a fiber box in the closet. It was like an unfinished project, which kind of sucks. But the internet is good enough that we can both stream at the same time. The only downside is we have to pay like $30 more, and it's a little bit less stable, but it could be worse. We could have Australian internet.
That is considerably worse.
Yeah.
So fair point.
So we haven't had a session for about, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. And to summarize what's happened in 3 words, I would say Russia, Russia, Russia. Because before I left, it was North Korea, North Korea, pretty much every week. That was the first talking point. And just from my cursory look at news and current events and stuff, it's all about the summit in Finland, Helsinki, between Putin and Trump, and then you have the investigation, what Russia has been doing, the meddling. We've talked about that before, but what new has happened?
With the meddling stuff, there was what was it? I think it was an indictment for 12 or so Russians for election meddling that was issued. And that was issued just before the Helsinki Summit, which made some people suspicious, at least as for the timing. But yeah, they were all indicted basically on the grounds that they had engaged in influence operations targeting the 2016 election. There probably won't ever be any convictions on that, since I don't think they'll ever get a hold of any of them, since they're all in Russia. So it's almost a symbolic exercise. But nominally, that was sort of the big new thing that I remember. There was also some stuff about a campaign aid, some documents that were acquired through a Freedom of Information request by some journalists found that a campaign manager for the Trump campaign in 2016 supposedly was suspected of working with the Russians. I haven't read as much about that, but it doesn't seem there was as much proof there. At least not enough to go after him and convict him. So on that count, basically more of the same. Mostly suspicions and allegations, nothing really concrete.
But I think the main thing we can agree on, that the evidence has been kind of laid out in the actions of the actors involved, is the tone of the way our president acts toward Putin has changed in a massive way between Obama to Trump.
Oh yeah, there's definitely been a shift in policy preferences vis-a-vis how to manage Russia. You know, the Obama administration's approach was kind of autopilot, sort of apply generic pressure and then hope that at some point they give concessions, but otherwise not really paying much attention to it. Whereas the Trump administration is kind of trying in fits and starts to have some kind of rapprochement where they improve relations and kind of negotiate some of these policy differences between the United States and Russia vis-a-vis Syria, Ukraine, etc. Yeah, the Helsinki Summit was kind of supposed to be that, or I think a lot of people were thinking that's what it would be, and that led to a lot of consternation. Because, you know, there were a lot of people who were afraid that Trump would go into the meeting with Putin and start offering concessions, and there would be some big announcement that might undercut NATO and other American alliances in the world, if not U.S. foreign policy in general. And instead, he mostly just whined about the Mueller investigation. Mm-hmm. Not to any great effect either. So, really, all things considered, that was probably the best you could have hoped for as far as outcomes on the Helsinki Summit. There was not much of substance, it would seem, that was agreed in the talks between Trump and Putin. They have said that it's really meant to be more of a opener, meant to be sort of the initial meeting that sets the stage for further meetings in which matters of more substance are discussed. But thus far in that particular summit, it doesn't really seem like much was accomplished. It seems like the Mueller investigation was the principal focus, and then they just kind of very lightly touched on some of the other actual matters of disagreement. So I don't think anything will really come of that, at least in the short term.
That seems fairly similar to the meeting with Kim Jong-un of North Korea.
Yeah, it's very similar. Very similar. Mostly kind of meant to break the ice and establish a dialogue, but nothing has, you know, with the North Korea dialogue, nothing much has come of it. What negotiations there have been have mostly been between lower-level functionaries, and it's not really clear what kind of verification regime is in place, if any, and, you know, just what progress has been made on that count. And I suspect the summit series with Putin and Russia is probably going to be pretty similar in that vein. Yeah, mostly for show, probably. If they can get something substantive out of that, you know, more power to them, that's possible, but it seems the focus for now is more on the optics, as the poli-sci people say.
What does that mean, optics? For the non-poli-sci.
Well, optics as in just how it looks politically. How does it look superficially to people watching the news or reading about it or what have you? It looks like he's doing something, so it's good optics.
I see.
Now, whether or not it's actually meaningful, that's kind of more in the eye of the beholder. For now, at least, it doesn't seem that substantive, but we'll see.
Yeah, we've talked about posturing before, and how that's kind of Trump's go-to for engaging with other world leaders, where it's not like they aren't signing in anything in particular in the immediate term, but they're changing the tone by the way they're interacting with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. You know, they're just kind of hoping to change the framing of the relationship and the dialogue by meeting like this, in the hope that it can kind of open some doors. Given the reaction to the summit, it seems kind of unlikely, since that generated an immense amount of pushback back in the United States. You know, I don't really think any kind of rapprochement is in the cards for U.S. and Russia, just because of there's so much skepticism in Congress and amongst the U.S. electorate. You know, any effort to offer any real concessions to Russia would be met with severe rapprochement. Well, not reproach, rather. So I don't think it would be politically viable. He could try it, but probably Congress would shut it down. Congress has, when it comes to concrete foreign policy actions and policies, Congress kind of does have the power to intercede if it feels like it. It is the most powerful branch of government. You wouldn't necessarily know it by watching them, since they have become increasingly deferential to the executive branch over the past 30 years. But technically, should they wish to exercise it, they have the potential to exercise the most powerful of any of the three branches. So we may yet see that going forward, depending on the context of further foreign policy developments.
What's interesting thinking about the potential power versus the actual power of a branch of government, and that kind of depends on the current climate and the cooperation between the parties. Because if you think about, if the legislative branch works together as much as they possibly can, it's really strong. But if they don't work together at all, it's effectively worthless. Like, they can't actually do anything.
Yeah, hyperpartisanship has neutered it to a degree, such that there's a coordination failure as far as exercising the congressional responsibility to oversight over the government. You know, there's a tendency to kind of let things slide for somebody in your party that you wouldn't let slide for somebody in the other party. And that's gotten worse with time. So certainly, yeah, you're right in that sense. There is a certain amount of coordination failure there that's hobbling them. But there could be, again, depending on the context going forward of certain actions taken by the executive branch, it could be that something happens that is sufficiently egregious to create enough of a de facto coalition between the parties that they could do something substantive. Again, it just depends on the context. Also, probably elections. Something to point out here, as far as reading the Trump administration and some of its policies and executive actions, a lot of what they're doing over the past few months, and will probably continue to do for the next few months, is posturing for the midterm elections. So, you know, they're trying to kind of hype up their base and try to motivate people to get out and vote. So they're acting a little more eccentric than usual at this point because of those upcoming midterm elections. And that's probably there's probably going to be more of that on the horizon as the elections get closer and closer. It'll be interesting to see how much the tone of politics in Washington changes after the midterms. I would imagine it'll be quite a bit less partisan, less tense. There'll be a little more focus on just trying to get things done and actually make policy. So at that point, there could be less rabidly partisan politics and policies being pushed by the executive branch, and certainly by Congress as well. Ideally, anyway. Maybe not. You never can tell. These are anything but predictable times, so we'll see. But in general, after a midterm election or a major national election, things kind of tone down a little bit. And that Helsinki summit was the tail end of a wider trip through Europe, and it was pretty colorful stuff. The first stop had been the Nato Summit, and it was there that you kind of heard Trump kind of clashing with other leaders of NATO member states about they're not spending enough on defense. He kind of pushed them to reach what is basically not a mandatory requirement, but a nominal target of 2% of GDP spent on defense. And that nominal target is not met by very many NATO member states, and the United States government has long kind of complained about that and pushed NATO member states to try to reach it. Nominally, Donald Trump came out after the summit and said that they had agreed to reach that 2% spending level, but no sooner had he said that than the other leaders came out and said no such agreement was made. They just agreed to work towards it. So somebody's bullshitting. We don't quite know who, but it would seem that there probably wasn't anything more than the most basic nominal of agreements there. So probably there won't be a lot of traction on that going forward. I wouldn't expect much movement any more than what was already planned. European member states had already been increasing defense spending somewhat in response to tensions over Russia and suspicions over Russian ambitions on the continent. So countries like Germany and Eastern Europe especially have been increasing defense spending on that count. Something else that came out of that summit that really surprised people was Trump saying that the spending target should be increased to 4%. It surprised everybody. He apparently hadn't really talked to anybody about that. He kind of just set it off the cuff later. So nominally that's kind of floating around too, that maybe the United States will in future push for a 4% spending target, which seems extremely unlikely. Most countries are spending between 1 and 1.5% on defense spending, so that would be more than doubling total defense budgets, which would be a tall order in most countries, especially countries that have budgets that are already straining under a lot of social spending, like a lot of European nations are. So then he there wasn't a lot of agreement there, and eventually he left, and everybody just kind of breathed a sigh of relief, because the big fear leading into the summit was that he might suggest that the United States would not honor its Article 5 commitment to collective defense under the NATO treaty. So there was a fear he might do that, or otherwise suggest the United States would pull out of NATO. That didn't happen, so the worst fears were kind of allayed. There was some tension over the spending targets, but most people just kind of shrugged that off and let it slide. Trump basically declared victory and went home. He basically said that they'd agreed to increase spending and then left. And European leaders were pretty much content to let him have that and just stay quiet basically and lie low until the next summit. And after the NATO summit, he went over to the UK to visit Theresa May, and that was also colorful. He criticized May and her government's approach to Brexit, suggesting that the Brexit negotiations were not, that the proposed Brexit plan that the May government had put forward would not deliver the Brexit the voters had voted for. Now, if you haven't been following the Brexit stuff, this was a very sensitive time to do that, because it came in the wake of a big cabinet meeting by the May government at a place called Chequers. Maybe somebody from the UK can correct me on the pronunciation, but basically there was a big cabinet meeting at which differences between different factions in the Tory party were kind of hashed out, and some kind of consensus plan reached as to what Brexit should look like and what the British government should be pushing for. And there were a lot of tensions coming out of that meeting. Nominally there was consensus, but there was a lot of ill will afterwards, and a lot of pro-Brexit Tories dropped out of the May government, resigned from the May government as a result. And there's some suspicion that there might be a push for a vote of no confidence that could result in Prime Minister May being overturned and being replaced by somebody else. This is in conjunction to what was already high tension from a series of legislative battles in Parliament over parliamentary powers vis-a-vis the direction of Brexit negotiations and what Britain's Brexit objectives should be. And in those battles, it was the Remainers, the anti-Brexit people, who were really pushing for more power to influence the Brexit process, and in order to ensure a softer Brexit, if possibly even another referendum. So all of these tensions are going, and there's a lot of uncertainty in British politics. And then here comes Donald Trump talking about how, this Prime Minister May isn't doing a great job, and this isn't really what they were voting for. And so there was a lot of consternation in the May government on that count. And eventually, he did meet with her, and she kind of talked to him and explained the situation and the sensitivity of the negotiations and intra-government tensions. And so later on, he kind of walked back on that criticism and gave some flattering comments about, Prime Minister May's leadership, and asserted that Brexit was complex and that he'd support whatever they decided on. So kind of a typical Trumpian approach, to kind of open with criticism and then just to talk to somebody and be convinced that, oh, okay, let's do something else. And then he left. So that was pretty much the crux of his UK visit, just sort of stirring the pot and then kind of arbitrarily leaving without much to show for it. It's not really clear if any wider agenda was discussed between the two of them as far as US-UK cooperation or foreign policy objectives or anything of that sort. So it seems to have been a pretty narrowly focused, limited visit. Which really wouldn't be a surprise, because from what I read about the NATO Summit, it seems like world leaders are kind of going out of their way not to engage Donald Trump in negotiations or discussions. There seems to be a purposeful effort to kind of keep what negotiations and talks there are to a very narrowly limited scope, such that they don't kind of go off track and enter some other sphere where he says something that maybe further destabilizes relations. So other nations' leaders are kind of hedging their bets by doing that and trying to minimize the damage that he might do advertently or inadvertently. So the UK visit seems to have been designed similarly, and as a result, both the NATO summit and the UK visit weren't really productive, at least by traditional metrics. So then both of those later led to the Helsinki summit, which we just talked about, and so there were more colorful statements there, but the overall result was pretty much the same, which is a lot of talk but not a lot to show for it. So then he came home, and that was sort of his adventure through Europe. It was an interesting, week or two or so, reading about those events. But it certainly didn't assuage a lot of fears about the Trump government's predictability, which is important in foreign relations. People need to know kind of where you stand, what you're going to do, etc. It is possible to use unpredictability strategically, but it's not really clear the degree to which the Trump administration is doing that, and if they are, the degree to which they're doing it successfully, or what they're using it to chase, what their objective would be if they were doing that. So kind of a Rorschach test there as to how you read the Trump administration in that regard. Different people will have different opinions on that. But overall, the trip was colorful and eventful, but not really much of substance has changed since then. Subsequent meetings that might emerge as a follow-up, like further meetings with Trump, those could be more substantive, kind of like what I said earlier, but we'll see. It's very much a we'll see stage right now. But that was kind of the big thing over the past couple weeks as far as Trump and the Trump administration. There's also been some trade war stuff, but that's that's tricky. Because kind of like what we discussed the last time, it's very hard to read the Trump administration in general, but especially their trade policy. It's not entirely clear what the objective is, whether it's national security or whether it's a complete restructuring of trade relationships, or whether he's trying to sabotage trade so that he can be more isolationist and protectionist. I mean, anybody's guess at this point. It's not really clear. The Chinese have basically stopped talking to them. Their approach basically is a hands-off approach, just kind of do whatever. We'll just tit for tat retaliate against anything you do, and we'll just go from there. The Europeans are a little more engaged, but they're also a little more recalcitrant. They're putting a lot of pressure on the Trump administration to try to be a little more relaxed and to give more concessions and to give more exemptions in recognition of the nominally friendly relations between Europe and the United States. They may yet back off of that. They may find that it's more productive just not to talk about it and try to keep it out of the news as much as possible. We'll see. But for now, their strategy is to be a little more aggressive in terms of pushing for their interests. Yeah, I did have some commentary on the trade wars, but we can save it since I know we have some questions.
Yeah, questions.
I think we had some leftover from last time, so I think we could kind of try to pick up where we left off.
Well, in the sense of not everyone who was here last time is here, we might save those as reserve after we've done the ones of people who are present.
Yeah, fair point. So then let's see. Today's questions then started with, is the market going hard bearish? Should I buy inverse ETFs? I don't know that it's going hard bearish. I think what's happening now is a lot of uncertainty. You know, there's been a lot more volatility in the market because of uncertainty over the trade war. You know, specifically because the trade war is hard to read and people are uncertain about where it's going to go and how it's going to end up. There's a lot of uncertainty, and markets don't like uncertainty, so that's introducing a lot of volatility. Whether or not that's going to go hard bearish is going to ultimately depend on not really so much on sentiment, so much as the hard numbers. You know, if there really is a downturn in consumption or GDP or, you know, something, there has to be some significant indicator that a recession is looming, I think, for the market to really go bearish. I think for now it's just hedging. So in that sense, I don't think it's getting too bad. That could change if the trade war kind of really spirals and escalates dramatically. That could generate a lot of bad sentiment that kind of spirals itself out of control and creates kind of an artificial downturn. That remains to be seen. But for now, I wouldn't read it as a hard bearish turn, at least not yet. And whether or not you should buy inverse ETFs or anything else for that matter is more the realm of somebody who knows a lot more about finance than I do. I don't have a license, so I can't really give out a lot of advice, at least with any credibility. So I wouldn't venture so far as to give financial advice. Given how bad my finances are, I'm probably the last person you should be asking about it. I'm not even sure I know what inverse ETFs are. I know what an ETF is, but an inverse ETF, that doesn't sound very familiar. I'd probably have to look that up. So I don't know about that. Let's see, the next question was, what do you think about lucid dreaming? Well, the short answer, I don't. I don't have really any strong opinions one way or the other about lucid dreaming. I don't really engage in a lot of the psychedelic exploration or any of that sort of thing. That's more of a Kukio question. He would have been more into that. Those are more his realm.
Or a Neuro question. That's pretty close to my domain.
Well, what would you say to that?
Well, dreams are a frontier that isn't super well understood by hard science. Soft science certainly enjoys approaching that kind of domain of subjects, which is fun. If you want to consume some media that could maybe open some doors for seeing what the frontier looks like, Waking Life is a pretty interesting movie that has a lot of the concepts presented. It's not one that's going to necessarily answer all the questions about what dreams are, why we have them, and how you can interpret them and that kind of stuff, but it certainly kind of lays the groundwork for what is in front of us, the type of dream experiences we have, and how a person could kind of chip away at understanding that process.
And what was it again?
Waking Life, which is kind of contradictory to the subject at hand. It's about dreams, but it's called Waking Life.
Well, when you're dealing with a psychedelic, you probably don't really need a high threshold for things making sense.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, thank you for the answer. It's a lot better than mine. Let's see. So the next one. Hi, not sure if you covered this topic already, but could you share your knowledge on the quote-unquote New Deal policies as a reaction to a crisis and when and how similar methods were used? So I'm not entirely sure whether you mean New Deal style of policies as a reaction to any given crisis, or specifically the New Deal policies from the 1930s as a response to the Great Depression. I could kind of read the question either way. So, I mean, as for the actual Great Depression, the New Deal policies were basically a set of policies here in the United States that were designed to create employment opportunities for people that had been laid off and were having trouble finding work, of which there were a great many people during the Great Depression. And so that led to the famous alphabet soup of federal agencies designed to create various jobs, you know, like park ranger or forest firefighter, if that's a thing. You know, just government works jobs, basically. And so a lot of those were created in response to the Great Depression to try to deal with that mass unemployment. There was also a number of other policies that involved regulating banks and confiscating gold and a whole bunch of other more obscure stuff. I don't know as much about that. I haven't studied the New Deal in depth, so I don't have a lot in depth to say about it that I could really give you on that count. But at the time, they were both revolutionary and very popular, at least amongst blue-collar labor. You know, the idea of the federal government creating work like that in response to an economic crisis was not entirely new, but it had never been done on that scale, and it was certainly extremely controversial. You know, that led to a creation of those agencies led to a number of Supreme Court cases, which resulted in a number of them being shot down. Not just the agencies, but a number of the regulatory actions, and that almost resulted in some Banana Republic style kangaroo court style politics. What happened was the government, as well as the government supporters, were getting tired of the Supreme Court getting in the way of their proposed changes and policies, so they actually threatened to stack the court. And if you don't know what it means to stack the court, that means to increase the number of seats on a Supreme Court, such that you can increase the number of appointees on the court that you appoint. So normally you have to wait for people to retire or go out of your way to remove them to replace court justices with people that are more amenable to your politics. But if you increase the number of seats, then you can basically artificially increase the proportion of people that are political appointees, the people that you yourself appoint. So the Roosevelt administration threatened to do that, and there was an immense amount of backlash even amongst supporters, because that was a little too far even for them. So that eventually went nowhere, but over the subsequent few years, a number of justices basically retired early, I think it was. And so the Roosevelt administration ended up getting its chance anyway to kind of shape the court going forward. And that paved the way for sort of the institutionalization of a lot of New Deal style of policies. But it was immensely controversial. It was still a very conservative country at that time. Kind of still is in many ways, economically speaking, but especially at that time. And so while on the one hand it was immensely popular, especially for working people who felt like the government was failing them, who felt like, you know, society in general, the economy, etc., had kind of failed them, it was very popular to have those policies because they did feel that they were at least trying to recognize even their problems and to try to do something about them. Now, as to the other way you could read this question is New Deal style of, like, how would I read that style of politics? Like, how do you? That's tough, because it really depends on the legality for one, because there are a lot of politicians who are populist, which is kind of what FDR was. He was a populist style of politician. There are populist politicians who will bend the rules, so to speak, too much in an effort to try to get votes. And they'll do so in a way that's very destructive. If you want an example of that, you can look at Argentina and Juan Perón. Juan Perón was a military officer who ended up president of Argentina. There's a lot of kind of complicated history there. It's like an officer's coup in the 1940s, and then it's some internal dissension between the officers, and then some jockeying for power, and then Perón using the Department of Labor to try to create a cult of personality. There's issues there, but suffice to say, Juan Perón was a populist leader who won the presidency and then led Argentina for a number of years in the late 40s, early 50s. And his approach to politics was very much to pander to the interests of labor, and specifically conservative nationalist labor. He kind of created a populist coalition in that vein. And he significantly increased labor rights, but also government spending. And the distribution of resources towards labor in general was skewed towards them. And that worked for a while, because Argentina had built up a huge amount of foreign reserves over the course of World War II. Argentine-American relations were not very good during World War II. That's a whole other conversation. But Argentina was at least nominally on the side of the United States and the Allies, and they kind of towed the line enough in the Pan-American Union to get some of the subsidies and goodies from the United States that were given out in order to kind of bolster them as a kind of, in some cases, a bribe, basically, to be on the side of the Allies, in other cases, a substantive effort to kind of help them help themselves and help the Allied cause. So in Argentina's case, they ended up with a huge amount of surplus. Also, there was just a lot of exports, because there was a lot of purchasing of commodities of the sort that Argentina exported a lot of, so there was a lot of that too. But long story short, lots of foreign exchange that could be used to import equipment such that they could effectively pursue an import substitution economic development strategy, which is where you try to develop your own industries instead of importing goods and trying to rely on your own exporting industries. So they tried to use that foreign exchange to develop their own industries, and that led to some development and more opportunities for labor and very high wages, and it was good for a couple of years before it started to implode, because all the imports were depressing the Argentine currency, and eventually the foreign exchange reserves ran out. And at that point, inflation started growing, and then eventually it got out of control, and then the import substitution couldn't work anymore because they couldn't import the equipment they needed in order to modernize industry, and then the whole economy basically just tanked. And that's an example of the long-term negative effects of poorly planned populist policies that are designed to, on the one hand, deal with a crisis, but on the other hand, deal with it in an unsustainable way. So here in the US, FDR, that is the Roosevelt administration, was better about that. It's debatable whether he was just a good planner or whether his hands were tied, because the US political institutions kind of prevented him from going as far as he might have wanted. That's a whole other debate. But basically, how you read populist policies like that, it depends on the context. It can be done well, but it's very hard to resist the pull of that demand from the public for ever more resources to be granted them by the government. So it's a slippery slope, basically. I mean, even if your administration is able to plan it well, subsequent populist administrations will almost invariably screw it up at some point. That's that siren call of power, the ability to just generate votes so easily with basically the distribution of money, of government resources, is very hard to sustain over time without inculcating a corrupt political culture that eventually self-destructs your populist politics, if not your economy in general. You can kind of see that with Venezuela to a degree. The Chavista politics were very popular, and when the government, because the government had not given enough services and attention to the working class in Venezuela through much of Venezuela's history. But it wasn't a problem so long as oil prices were high and the government could kind of afford them. But then when oil prices tanked, it didn't work out so well. Now in Ecuador, by contrast, they had a similar Chavista-style left government that used oil money to try to buy votes and kind of improve the lot of working people. But when oil prices collapsed, Ecuador's economy didn't go with it. Ecuador's economy continued to do at least okay, because they had done a better job of planning for low oil prices, unlike Venezuela. So it can be done, but it's hard to do and it's hard to sustain. So it's very kind of risky in a sense. It's better, I mean, in developed countries you don't see it as much, because in general economies are more resilient in developed society, developed countries, such that there's not as many people kind of demanding populist policies. That's kind of changing now because of structural changes in the economy, kind of creating a very large an increasingly large class of people who are kind of the people who have lost out from those changes, be they free trade or automation or whatever. So that's a problem, but that's kind of a singularity event. In general, developed economies are kind of more resilient to that. Whereas developing economies have weaker public supports for the working class, and so the working class in developing countries tends to struggle more during downturns, which creates a disproportionately strong demand for populist politics. And because political cultures and institutions in developing countries are not as strong as in developed countries, they tend to be less able and less resilient to the tensions and temptations that are created by those circumstances. Which is why you disproportionately see developing countries kind of struggle more with populist politics than developed countries. So that's kind of a little rant about that. I'm still not entirely sure if that gets to the gist of the question. I hope so. If not, please feel free to kind of ask again and elaborate a bit, and I can kind of get back to it. Let's see, the next one was, is there a plan to honor the Belfast Agreement after Brexit? Kind of. Kind of. I mean, this goes to the whole issue about the Irish border, and I guess I should start from the beginning for people not familiar with the Belfast Agreement and Northern Ireland. Basically, Northern Ireland is a part of Britain, the United Kingdom, that has very tense, I guess what you would call sectarian politics. It is mostly Scots-Irish people, which you would call kind of Ulster-Irish people, who are very pro-UK and want to stay in the UK. But there's also a large minority of Irish people who want Northern Ireland to be a part of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And there was a long period of time, several decades, starting in, I think, the 1970s, maybe even earlier, when Irish militants engaged in numerous acts of terrorism against the British government in order to try to force them to give Northern Ireland to Ireland. And so that led to retaliatory killings and state terrorism on the part of, if not the British government, certainly on the part of the Northern Ireland government, such as it was. I guess they didn't have local government at that time in that thing, but they did have local police, and they certainly had local militias. That was the famous Orangemen. And so there was a series of tit-for-tat killings on the part of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, or the real IRA, or whatever the hell they were. There's a whole bunch of different iterations of the IRA at the time, and the Orangemen on the other side. So there was a lot of violence, and eventually there was an agreement that resulted in some amount of peace, basically a de facto peace accord between the different factions. And I hope I'm getting this right. I think this is the Belfast Agreement, but basically the agreement was that everybody would lay down their arms, everybody would accept that Northern Ireland was a part of the UK, but in exchange there would be perpetually open borders between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So Northern Ireland would be separate from Ireland politically, but the open border would ensure that there was free movement of people and free movement of goods and services. So in a sense, it was de facto kind of a part of Ireland, in a sense, economically, and if not socially. So that was the nominal agreement, and so long as Britain was in the European Union, that was never really a problem, because part of being in the European Union was basically having open borders. That was kind of the Schengen Agreement and having free trade and all of that jazz. Well, then Brexit came and kind of blew a hole in that. So now there's this question of how the United Kingdom can maintain this agreement to maintain open borders between Ireland and Northern Ireland, as according to this peace agreement, the Belfast Agreement. Again, I hope I'm remembering that correctly. How the British government does that, but at the same time pulls out of the European Union and the common free trade area, the common market within the European Union, because Ireland is a part of the European Union. So if the UK has an open border with Ireland, it de facto has an open border with the entire EU, which is going to be a problem, because if you're going to leave the EU, you want nominally to have a separate economy that has border checks and that allows you to have a separate set of regulations such that you could, for example, negotiate a free trade agreement with another country outside the EU that would allow you to depart from EU standards if you needed to in order to get that free trade agreement signed. That's kind of hard to do if you still have an open border with the European Union, because then European Union goods could come in that are maybe cheaper and undermine your own goods or the goods of your free trade partners, and it turns into a big mess. And it's also a two-way street, because the European Union doesn't necessarily want to deregulated Britain to have to flood the EU market with a bunch of cheap goods through that open Irish border. So it's not really clear how they do that, and that's the open question kind of going forward. So when you ask if there's a plan to honor the Belfast Agreement after Brexit, technically the answer is yes, because both the European Union and the UK government have committed themselves to reaching such an agreement. That is an objective, to maintain that open border. But given that that's virtually impossible to do without the UK somehow remaining in the single market or remaining in a customs union, and given the fact that the British government says it wants to leave both the customs union and the single market, I'm not real sure how they plan on doing that. So if you're asking me if there's a concrete plan, hell no, definitely not. That's kind of the big subject of discussion going forward. Nominally, the May government in Britain has a nominal plan that is this weird sort of hybrid customs union, where the UK maintains a customs union with the European Union, but where any goods imported to the UK cannot be sold on to the European Union without having additional customs duties applied. So the UK in this case is kind of inside and outside a customs union with the European Union. The idea is that only goods and services in the UK can be sold to the European Union, not goods that are imported from non-EU countries to the UK. Those goods cannot be exported on to the EU without an additional tariff being applied, basically the EU external tariff. If that sounds complicated, it's because it is, and pretty much nobody thinks it's workable. It depends a lot on technology that's supposed to be implemented, customs border enforcement technology, basically, that nobody's developed and nobody's ever used before. And as a result, there's very little confidence either that it would be workable if it was accepted, or that the European Union would accept it in the first place. In order for the European Union to accept that proposal, they would have to have faith that the UK would be capable administratively of enforcing this sort of double customs union. And I doubt that they would be willing to do that. They would be doing the UK a big favor if they did, and I don't get the impression the European Union is in the mood to give any favors in Brexit negotiations. Given also that they have leverage in the negotiations because of the size of the European Union market, they also, strategically speaking, don't really have to do that. It's not to say that the UK doesn't have any leverage, but relative degrees of leverage in Brexit negotiations is a whole conversation in itself. We can get into that if somebody wants to. They can tag Fuzzy Court and ask that question. But for now, to focus here, the answer is kind of yes and no on whether there's a plan to maintain the Belfast Agreement. Yes, there's a nominal commitment. No, there's no definitive plan. And it's not clear if there can be without a substantive change in Britain's negotiating strategy. So let's see. The next question was, what are your thoughts on the rescue of the White Helmets by Israel from Syria? There is some question whether they are Islamic State or Islamic fundamentalists and or humanitarian heroes. Also, why does Israel do this? So the two groups are not mutually exclusive. It's quite possible to be both a White Helmet and an Islamic fundamentalist. Last I checked, the White Helmets were not particularly discriminatory on that count. Part of what made them so effective is that basically all of the different militias on the side of the rebels accepted the White Helmets as an impartial force that they could trust. It also probably helped that they were largely staffed by locals. But basically, there's no requirement that you not be an Islamic fundamentalist to join. What's really matters is that you be willing to help out and risk your life to help other people. So nominally, they're kind of both in some cases, though not exclusively. I'm not saying it's an Islamic fundamentalist organization. It's probably a lot of different kinds of people depending on the location in question. Because again, I think it is mostly a locally staffed force. You know, it's not something where there's like a headquarters for the White Helmets where they organize all the White Helmets around Syria. It's more of a local operation. You know, it's kind of a franchising type thing, basically, where you can kind of take on the role wherever you are, so long as you're willing to kind of adhere to the same standards and pursue the same objectives. Let's see. So my thoughts on the rescue of the White Helmets by Israel. I mean, not really any. It's that kind of is part of a larger overarching conversation about the Syrian conflict and how it's winding down. For those who don't know, the Syrian government launched a big offensive about a month ago or so. I don't remember exactly when. They launched a big offensive into the south of Syria. And the south of Syria has been dominated by rebel groups. In fact, some of the earliest rebel groups were kind of started in the south. There had been a nominal ceasefire between the government and the rebels in the south for much of the past year and change, maybe even 2 years. Basically, both sides wanted to kind of focus on Islamic State. And also, the foreign backers of the southern rebels kind of were in a kind of on-again, off-again talks, peace talks with the Syrian government. And so the ceasefire was meant to kind of also help facilitate that. So there really hadn't been a lot of fighting in the south. But with the Syrian government having been triumphant over most of the other rebel groups in Syria and not being able to basically further expand against the what are they called? The Syrian Democratic Forces, and in the eastern Syria, basically the Kurds. That only really left the south of Syria. And so they've turned their attention there. And there hasn't really been a lot of consequence. The foreign backers of the southern rebels have not really come to their defense. So it really seems like the end of the road for the overarching Syrian civil war. Southern rebels had largely been supported by the Saudis and the Jordanians to some degree. A little bit the U.S. You know, of the rebels the U.S. supported in the war, most of them were in the south. The rest were in the east as the Kurds, but it was always kind of half-hearted. So the southern rebels have basically been hung out to dry. This is kind of the end for them. It doesn't look like anybody's going to stop the Syrian government from steamrolling them. So probably the Syrian government will be in control of almost all, if not all, of southern Syria within the next couple of months, basically. That's at least what it looks like right now. And given that the Syrian government has taken a rather dim view of White Helmet to kind of sees them as being rebel sympathizers at best, if not outright rebels in general, there was a sense that evacuating the White Helmets was kind of the right thing to do. Now, why they evacuated the White Helmets in particular and not other rebel groups and whatnot, I don't know. It may be that you didn't need to evacuate the rebel groups. Maybe they didn't want to leave, or maybe they had alternative arrangements in place. Who's to say? But the White Helmets in general are probably the least controversial element, so to speak, of the Syrian opposition. You know, in general, they have a pretty good reputation. Again, they're not exclusively anti-fundamentalist Islamic. You know, they're not political in that sense. They're not pro or anti-Islamic radicalism. They're just what you would call a civil, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Kind of a civil society institution. So if you're going to evacuate anybody, the White Helmets is probably the least controversial. It kind of stands to reason. From what I read on the, from what I heard on the radio today, Israel was the country that evacuated them and not the usual kind of third-party NGOs, because apparently rebel-held territory is too dangerous for NGOs, at least that's what was said. So Israel kind of stepped in to fill the gap. I wouldn't read too much into it, because really if Israel and the Saudis wanted to interfere in Syria, they would help out those southern Syrian rebels in that offensive, and they're categorically not doing that, which says to me that that interest in intervention is waning, that they're more interested in cooperating probably either with Turkey or the United States in the rebel territory that they're kind of affiliated with, and that the southern Syrian rebels have kind of outlived their usefulness in that sense. So it's probably more just kind of helping out, kind of wrapping things up, kind of doing Israel and any affiliated countries doing their part to kind of wind up operations in southern Syria. see. So, yeah, I think that pretty much covers the question. If not, let me know and we can kind of get into it. But that's roughly my impression of what's happening there. It's I don't really see it as a significant marker. It's not going to be a big milestone in the conflict. It's more just a part of the overarching dying down of operations in southern Syria as the Syrian government kind of rolls through and reclaims the territory. Let's see, what are the real use case of blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies as a whole? So I interpret that question as meaning what are the actual utilitarian uses of blockchain technology? What are some good uses beyond just as a generic digital currency? The best use that I've read thus far, and the one that's already gaining some traction, is documentation. Basically a way of recording certain documents. For example, what's the phrase I want? Deeds to houses. Basically the paperwork that illustrates whether or not you own a house, the deed to a house. Something like that is good for blockchain because it kind of cuts out the government, right? Normally you have to get a government document to kind of verify and validate a house purchase and to get the appropriate documentation recognizing legal ownership. And that would allow you to prove ownership in the event of legal action. But a lot of governments in the developing world are very inefficient and corrupt, and so it can be very hard to get those documents. Sometimes they're so corrupt that you can bribe them to get a document to somebody else's house, with obvious repercussions, legally speaking. So blockchain technology can allow you to create a verifiable document that can prove that you own a given house without having to involve government and the government documentation. That's potentially very useful. There's also verification in general. You know, I think there was a firm in Australia that has started using blockchain verification for some of their documentation. But those are the examples that come to mind. Those are some of the best uses, practically speaking. Let's see, the next question was, what do government/people gain from these trade wars? Not much. Trade wars are, in general, not good for the economy. That's, speaking as an economist, that's kind of the official economist view, that trade wars are in general bad for everybody. It's kind of the flip side of free trade. You know, with free trade, economists will tell you that in general everybody benefits, although there will be some people who lose out. Trade wars, in contrast, are basically the opposite. Most people lose out, although there will be a few people who win out. So I guess people who will benefit the most will be people in industries that do not have a comparative advantage. So in general, developed countries are capital-intensive economies where labor-intensive industries do not have a comparative advantage. So labor-intensive industries, stuff like labor-intensive manufacturing or other equivalents in the economy, don't do well in free trade. In contrast, in developing countries, labor-intensive industries are relatively competitive and do better, but capital-intensive industries don't do as well because, well, a variety of reasons. That's a whole conversation in and of itself. But in a protectionist regime, in a developing country, it's the capital-intensive industries that tend to benefit more because they're not as competitive and they're being protected from that competition. That kind of goes back to what I was talking about with import substitution development strategy, where you're protecting your industry. So developing countries often try to use, or have in the past often tried to use, import substitution, where you create trade barriers for developed manufactured goods so that your own manufacturing sector has a chance to kind of be competitive and rise up. Very rarely works out. We can kind of talk about that if somebody wants to as to why, but basically protection of whatever kind for labor-intensive or capital-intensive industries inculcates inefficiency that reduces competitiveness, and it creates a political interest group comprised of the people who work in those industries that perpetually demands protection, if not ever more protection. So it's kind of it kind of creates a self-perpetuating cycle of subsidy and government of government subsidies that damages government finances and eventually becomes unsustainable. So economically speaking, it's bad news generally. Politically speaking, it's not good either because it creates a constituency of people who constantly push for that and can be easily bought off politically with the promise of more protections. But those people do win out. And there is the question of national security or unfair trade practices in which certain countries engage in practices that unfairly put foreign competitors at a disadvantage. That again is a whole other conversation. But in such examples, there is a better case to be made for what are called trade remedies, where you create trade protections that are meant to compensate for the unfair trade practices and give your producers a more even playing field. What constitutes an uneven playing field and what constitutes unfair trade practices is a very difficult thing to define, and it's bedeviled free trade negotiations for much of the past 30 years. Even something like dumping is very controversial because it's very hard to define. And because it's hard to define, it tends to be defined in whatever way is politically expedient, which creates tensions in trade relationships. One of the reasons the Doha round of trade negotiations has stalled out is over negotiations over non-tariff barriers of that kind. Now, if you don't know what the Doha round of trade negotiations is, that's basically the newest round of trade negotiations in which the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was meant to be expanded to give it more powers to basically expand the scope of free trade, etc. And it's been hung up on basically a perpetual political battle between developed countries and developing countries, and different views about what free trade should look like and what exemptions should be given to developing countries, and etc., etc. That's been hung up for basically 15 years now, 16 years. Very long time. It's one of the reasons you see so many bilateral trade deals now. You know, originally the hope was that free trade negotiations could be done multilaterally on a global scale through the WTO. But because that Doha round stagnated, everybody just kind of gave up and started doing bilateral trade negotiations. Got off on a tangent there. What was the original question? What do people gain from these trade wars? Some people in certain industries gain, but broader society in general does not, because they're paying more for goods that they could be getting cheaper, and because governments generally have to subsidize either directly or indirectly those industries. And it also introduces a vector for political corruption. That may or may not play out, but in general is a perpetual threat when you have protectionist regimes like that. So, a few people, but not a lot. How undemocratic is the electoral system in the US of A? What could be done to make it more democratic? I actually had an article on my Twitter feed, on my Twitter account, however you're supposed to say that. I don't know anything about Twitter. I have one and I post up to it. I had a story that I posted on there that was from Christian Science Monitor, I think, talking about how there were some problems with the US electoral system and some different ways you can fix it. I don't know how much of it I can remember off the top of my head, but the big criticism of the US electoral system basically comes down to gerrymandering. Basically, we have a first-past-the-post voting system where representatives are chosen to represent certain districts which are carved out of basically a map of a given state. So rather than having a representative system where everybody votes and then seats in the legislature are assigned to different political parties according to the proportion of the vote they got, instead we carve territory into different districts, and those different districts vote on their own representatives. So there are kind of different costs and benefits to that, but the principal cost right now that people are kind of focused on is that a lot of these districts are being designed in a way to favor specific political parties. So in certain states, the majority political party, the one that has the most power, will kind of go out of their way to design districts such that districts are very safe, such that there's 80% of the people in them vote a certain way, such that it's very easy for somebody from a given political party, or even from the opponent's political party, are very easy to win, and there's not a lot of real competition. And you know, a lot of the districts that end up getting drawn are very obviously gerrymandered. Like, they're very stupid looking. You know, they have these long stringing things that are just you know, just abominations of electoral engineering, basically. So there is a sense that it's a problem, and that the issue is that they're being drawn in a way that makes it more difficult for, I think what I read was that it makes it more difficult for Democrats at the federal level to pick up seats in the House of Representatives. Basically, in order to pick up a majority in the House of Representatives, Democrats would have to get a supermajority of the votes in national elections writ large in order to win a relatively smaller share of the votes in the House of Representatives. That's off the top of my head. I'm probably getting that wrong in some fashion, but that's kind of the gist of it. That there's been so much gerrymandering that it's not a really fair competition anymore. You could probably debate that. I'm sure there's a counter argument somewhere. You know, as far as national elections being skewed against Democrats, some of that probably has to do just with differences in states in terms of population. You know, I would expect it to be harder for Democrats to pick up votes just because of that geographic separation of states and differences in population. You know, in general, the trade-off in the federal government is that the House of Representatives is supposed to represent population, whereas the Senate is meant to allow states that have very small populations even representation.
House of Commons, House of Lords.
Kind of. I think it's a bit of an insult to the U.S. Senate to compare them to the House of Lords, because the House of Lords isn't even remote. It's not elected, for one. You know, the U.S. senators are elected in statewide elections, whereas in the House of Lords, as I recall, all of those people are appointed by the national government, and I think some of them are still hereditary. I think some of them are just passed down from generation to generation.
Do you mean
not
like
as many as
divine right of kings and nobles?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, I see.
I think they've been moving away from that. I think they have been moving more to a system where they're appointed, so the House of Lords can have at least some more democratic legitimacy. But yeah, there are still people, I believe, who have hereditary seats. Somebody from Britain can correct me on that. I don't want to talk out of my ass. This might be a good time to make the the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. You know, I have a stronger background in things like economics and foreign policy, but you know, it's not. I don't have universal knowledge in those things, and you know, there's a lot of stuff we talk about that doesn't touch on those things. So, my range of knowledge is wide, but the depth is sometimes shallow. So, I encourage people who are listening to kind of participate. It is meant to be more participatory anyway. So, you know, if I say something biased or stupid or ignorant or what have you, please do correct me. Please do jump in and chime in. And certainly the opinions of people from different countries that we talk about are also welcome, because it's always interesting to kind of get a different perspective, a first-hand perspective of people kind of in the countries involved. So that said, oh, right. So roughly that's my impression of how the electoral system is undemocratic. As to how you fix it, I mean, you could make it a representative voting system. You could do, I think one of the things I read about in the article was what they called ranked voting. And if you don't know what ranked voting is, basically instead of voting for one candidate, well, you still, basically the way it works is instead of voting for one guy on your voting ballot, you rank the candidates.
This is my favorite, this is my second favorite.
Exactly. And then they look at how the candidates are ranked, and whoever has the most favorable ranking wins the election. So that way, instead of basing the election on whoever has the most votes, it's based on who has the most first place and who has the most second place, and etc. And the different placements, I think, are weighted in such a way that somebody who has the most first place votes could still lose the election if another candidate got relatively more second place votes. Something to that effect. And the idea is to kind of prevent elections from becoming binary choices between just two parties. It's meant to kind of open up the field to allow more diversity in choice in terms of people running. Now, the criticism of that is that it's hard to kind of communicate that, myself being, just now being a case in point. It's a little tricky to understand if you're not familiar with it. And also, some people are just opposed to it on principle. In fact, I think even in the example in the article, there was a lot of people who... There was basically a district in Maine, I think, that trial ran this. They actually implemented a ranked voting system, and there was a bunch of people who rejected it outright and only ranked one candidate, that being the one they wanted to vote for, such that they were basically just voting it using the old system. So that's another kind of point of failure in the system, is that if you want to not rank anybody, you don't have to. You can totally just do what you've always done and just vote for one guy, which effectively kind of throws the system in a sense. So it's not hard to kind of defeat that if you don't want it. Also, I think another criticism was that it makes the elections very banal, very bland, and that people are too afraid to take risks and kind of take hard policy positions. It kind of waters down the politics, basically. So while it's meant to kind of create more diversity and to reduce partisanship, that's kind of the benefit of watering down the politics. There's less heated partisanship. It also kind of precludes people from taking more principled stands, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that was one of the criticisms. It's a really hard problem to solve, because no matter what solution you propose, there's going to be costs and benefits such that there's going to be some group of people who feels they're being discriminated against. We've talked about this before, and my answer in that regard is kind of the same. It's politically extremely difficult to reach a consensus on something like electoral systems, because invariably somebody feels they're being discriminated against. And you really don't want to have broad swaths of the population feeling they're being discriminated against in that vein, because that delegitimizes the political system such that they could feel entitled to rise up or otherwise undermine the electoral system. So if you are going to basically ignore a group like that and create a disenchanted group, you want to make sure you do it in a way that minimizes their size, at least. But given political tensions in the US, it's hard to minimize the size, given that it's almost invariably going to be either Democrats or Republicans complaining about one given policy solution or another, unfairly impacting them and their prospects. It's the kind of thing that you can only really solve at the grassroots level. And this kind of goes back to something we talked about the last time, which is that the best kind of reform politics is grassroots politics. If you can create a consensus at the grassroots level that supports a given reform initiative, then the reform initiative will have a much better chance of success. It'll have a lot more legitimacy, and people will just kind of understand and accept the costs of whatever policy initiative you're proposing. Whereas if you try to impose it from above, everybody feels like you're trying to kind of oppress them and impose an unwanted policy on them, if not unwanted values. A lot of people paint policy in terms of value, so invariably that's kind of what it ends up being a conversation about. So the best way you could kind of deal with problems with the US electoral system is to convince enough people that a given reform policy of one sort or another is worth the costs that it comes with. And if you could do that, that would go a long way towards solving the problem. And as far as the metagame of electoral systems, there really is no great way to do it. Every way comes with some pretty substantive downsides. I mean, some people like to crow about the representative system being better, but I don't think those people have ever had to suffer through a minority government. Minority governments are extremely unpopular and they're very ineffective. And that's to say nothing of hung parliaments, where you basically just don't have a government for a while. And all of those come with big costs. You can talk to the Belgians about that. They'll be happy to elaborate on the subject. So anyway, that's not a great answer. Electoral politics are not my forte. That's not quite something I know as much about, and so I'm a little wary of getting into it in too much depth. But roughly, that's my impression of the problem. You can certainly read more about it if you want a little more detail. Again, that CS Monitor article is somewhere on my Twitter feed. That would be a good place to start, I think. And then what could make it more democratic? Again, same deal. It's just any kind of politics that is inherently subjective is inherently controversial and dangerous, because then you're getting into values and subjective opinions and people's experiences, and that gets messy. So you have to kind of talk to people, negotiate, compromise, and reach a consensus over the long run. That's kind of the only real way you kind of deal with that on a fundamental level. So that's kind of my obscure meta answer to that question, without getting into too many policy details. I will say that you could do a lot worse than the US electoral system. It could be worse. There are other countries in the world that struggle with electoral politics a lot more than the US does. And one of the reasons electoral reform in the United States is not more of a front page issue is because fundamentally most Americans are pretty comfortable. Fundamentally, that lack of desire for change and the fact that radical voices are kind of coming to the fore and have disproportionate voice, a lot of that is because the bulk of the population is just a little too comfortable and doesn't really have enough reason to get involved.
Why
very
should
different.
I care?
Yeah, kind of that attitude. It's very different in other countries. I've heard it said that democracy is one of those things that you don't miss until you need it. And a lot of countries are in the circumstances where they need it, and people are definitely involved in those places. So you can take that as an example of how it could be worse. However bad you might think it is. It could be a lot worse. That's not to say don't be involved and try to push reform and whatever issue it is that's really got you. I don't want to discourage you from being involved on that count, but don't be too discouraged. It's not too bad, at least not yet. Let's see. What do you think about the current state of trade relations between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico? Do you think the relationship will be damaged, and if so, create a long-lasting rift? This kind of touches on another question, and it's kind of a meta question, an overarching question about whether or not the Trump administration and its policy preferences are a fluke, a kind of black swan event, in which case everything maybe goes back to normal after they're gone, or if this is kind of a marked trend, if this is going to mark a new trend in U.S. policy vis-a-vis its neighbors. And I think it's hard to tell right now, but in order to kind of answer this question, this specific question about relations between U.S., Canada, and Mexico and what the long-term damage could be, you have to kind of answer that other question about how long-term the Trump administration and what it represents is going to last. If it does have legs, and there is some reason to think that it does, then yeah, there could be some real long-term damage. But if this is just a black swan event, just a kind of one-off, basically what'll happen in that case is that everybody will just keep their head down and wait for everything to blow over. And then the next administration can start preparing things. There might be some, even in that case, even if it is a short-term thing, even if it is basically a political hurricane that we just have to kind of ride out, even in that case, there will be some short to medium-term repercussions, because everybody is going to kind of be a little suspicious of the United States going forward. Because it's going to be a kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing. Everybody's going to be afraid the United States could, at any time, turn back into Dr. Jekyll again, even if it does revert back to Mr. Hyde. So there is going to be a kind of period where people see if the United States maybe returns to populist politics, if it does at some point leave populist politics. And then once it's established that the United States is kind of quote-unquote back to normal, maybe then they start to trust more, and there's more momentum to bilateral cooperation. All of this assumes that Trumpian-style politics eventually go away, either after his first term or his second. Maybe they don't. And the reason you could think that they won't is that there is a kind of trend in U.S. foreign policy and in U.S. government away from interaction with the world. And this goes all the way back to the last years of the Bush administration. The Bush administration gets a lot of shit for being very interventionist and trying to blow up Iran and this, that, and the other. But by the last couple years of the administration, They had really cooled off very considerably, and they've backed off a lot of the rhetoric. And that marked a trend away from interventionism that continued with the Obama administration. I know a lot of people give the Obama administration shit for things like Yemen and, for other interventions, Libya, Syria, etc. But really, those interventions were very mild by historical standards. It was certainly a lot more mild than the stuff the Bush administration was doing. And it was pretty clear throughout the Obama administration that Barack Obama himself and a lot of his people and his National Security Council did not want to engage in interventionist policies. They basically got dragged in by one party or the other, either by people in his government or by allies in Europe, into the interventions that he participated in. So he continued that trend away from interventionism, and now we have Trump, who's taking it even further. It might be a little harder to see with Trump because he's so erratic. One day he's talking about bombing Iran, and the next day he's talking about leaving NATO, maybe. So who knows? But in general, he was elected in part because he was very critical of America being active overseas, of America being interventionist, of America taking a hard line against certain countries like Russia, etc. So there is this kind of secular trend away from interventionism and bilateral relations and etc. in U.S. policy making. So it could be that, however erratic Trump is, that trend away from the world continues with the new president, even if they are a more normal president. They could continue that in some vein to some degree. So if that's the case, probably the damage is permanent. In that sense, there probably will be a great reluctance of foreign states to engage in security, well, maybe not security cooperation, but probably trade cooperation. There will be a fear that at any time the United States could abandon an agreement or try to use integration that has occurred after the fact, after a trade agreement was implemented, try to use dependence on the increase in economic ties that free trade agreement engendered as leverage. So, for example, the Trump administration is in part using the economic integration that occurred after NAFTA, for example, with the automation, with the expansion of automotive supply chains into Mexico and Canada. They're using the economic value those supply chains have to Mexico and Canada to try to threaten Mexico and Canada into concessions. The idea being that the United States will, if they don't give concessions, impose tariffs of some sort, such that those supply chains have to come back to the United States and are pulled from Mexico and Canada. Now, there's a whole other conversation to be had there about why that's a bad idea. There's costs and benefits there too. There is with every possible policy. But basically, that's kind of the gist of it. And where was I? Oh, right. So yeah, in that case, that's sort of the gist of their approach. And if Trumpian-style politics are permanent, then fear of that kind of leverage being used as a threat in order to get more concessions that they had not originally given in the original trade negotiations, that'll really put people off of further trade talks. And so going forward over the long term, then, that would be probably off the cards, which would be detrimental to the long-term economic growth. It might be nice if you're in one of those industries that loses out from trade, that would give you some job security and stability that you haven't had in a while. But for the broader economy, that would reduce the overall number of opportunities for growth. So again, that's kind of two answers to the question. It just depends on Trump and whether or not he is a long-term phenomenon, whether or not the politics he represents of retreating from international politics is secular trend and not kind of a one-off. That remains to be seen. It's just kind of hard to tell right now because it is so early going. But I do think that if it is a black swan event, the damage is repairable. And you can already see right now that and I think we were talking about it earlier, the principal strategy right now on the part of U.S. partners, be they security partners or trade partners or both, is to kind of lie low and just wait for this to blow over, to kind of just minimize contact, minimize the damage that the Trump administration can do, drag their feet in negotiations of one sort or another, and basically just try to wait them out. That seems to be the principal strategy right now. So that would suggest that they're hoping that a new, more normal administration will come in that they can then negotiate with in more what they would consider good faith, or at least on more equal terms. That would suggest that what damage has been done can be repaired. And it may be that America's partners would be even more willing to give concessions to a post-Trump, quote-unquote, normal administration than they would to Trump. Because part of the U.S. negotiating position could be, hey, if you don't want another Trump administration, you need to give me something. I'm not going to pressure you like Trump did, but you do need to give me something to work with to kind of placate Trump supporters and Trump style of politics in the United States. And so there could be negotiations behind the scene that could result in more concessions in that vein. There would be more give and take than what probably the Trump administration has in mind, though. That really, the Trump style of negotiating seems to be very zero-sum, and it's not really clear whether there's room in that style of negotiating for the give and take that kind of needs to take place for a productive agreement. There's a lot of domestic political considerations that go into international negotiations. And if you don't leave room for those kinds of domestic political considerations in your partners, then you're almost certainly not going to have any kind of deal. And it's not clear that the Trump administration is kind of giving room for those kinds of considerations. I could be wrong, because I'm an outsider. I'm just trying to read what I see in the news. And what you see in the news is not everything. But given what I see in the news, I'm a little skeptical on that count. So a more, I hate to keep saying normal, because that's kind of ambiguous, but basically an administration that's more willing to have a give and take negotiation that is not zero-sum might get more concessions because they can play the don't want Trump again card. They can play that if you give me this, then it's less likely that populists win another election and that you have to contend with that sort of aggressive style of American international engagement. Anyway, that's off on a tangent. Basically, that's my impression of relations and the prospects for repairing relations. Let's see. Could you talk about the pros and cons of more division of power within a political system, comparing the Swiss or similar political system to the U.S.? It depends on how you would define division of power, because you could say division of power means giving more power, basically decentralization, which means more power for lower levels of government, more distribution of power among different levels of government, so that instead of having a lot of power in the central government, you kind of distribute that power among provincial governments, amongst local governments, etc. That's generally a good idea, depending on the size of your country. On the other hand, division of power could mean expanding decision-making power to a broader group of people, so that instead of having one guy, the president, make decisions in the executive branch, you could have like a committee, or you could have executive decisions being taken by referendum by the broader population. You could have some kind of system like that. So those are two different ways you could have division of power. The first, the decentralization approach, is better, because in that approach you're basically given different levels the discretionary power they need to deal with problems that are the most appropriate to deal with at those levels. In contrast, that latter approach, where you're just expanding the selectorate, so to speak, where you're expanding the number of voices that influence the policy-making process, that's less good because it makes it more difficult to reach a decision and to take action. Because the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the harder it is to do anything. Invariably things get bogged down in negotiations and stonewalling, and there are some people who feel the whole process is rigged and then they don't want to do anything and they try to sabotage the process. So, we talked a little bit about this last time. There does have to be some centralization to your executive branch. And, the deliberative body is generally the legislative branch. That's where you have the negotiations, the talks, the speech making, etc., the outlining of positions and what's acceptable and what's a red line, etc. All that stuff is generally better for the legislature because you have representatives from a lot of different communities who can kind of represent those communities' preferences. in a deliberative body. Whereas in the executive branch, everything kind of has to have a decision a lot sooner. Like, the Russians are coming, what do we do? Well, is it really serious? Do we really need to take strong action? Maybe we should wait and see. I mean, there's always going to be some negotiation there in any group of people. And the more people you have to kind of listen to in making a decision, the longer the decision-making process gets drawn out, and the more watered down the eventual action taken is. So those are some issues with, those are some pros for the first and some cons for the latter. I'm going to assume this person was referring more to decentralization. Well, especially since they refer to the Swiss system, since that's, well, the Swiss system is more of a referendum system. So in a sense, that's kind of more the latter. But the Swiss system limits that to things that the public actually wants to vote on. It's not everything. So long as you can get enough people to sign a petition, you can have a referendum on it in Switzerland. At least that's my impression. That can be good in the sense that it gives government policy more legitimacy. But as we've talked about before, referendums are not great ways to decide policy. And the reason is that if you have a really close referendum, it doesn't really solve anything. If you have a close referendum, nominally the side that wins should, quote-unquote, get its way because it won. But there's going to be it's clear from the result of the referendum in that case that there's going to be a large minority of people who will be really upset if you do that thing, whatever it was the referendum was about. And it's not good for politics if you impose a policy on a large minority of dissenters against their will. That's a great way to destabilize your politics and your population, if not also your economy. If you want a great example of that, look no further than the UK and Brexit, where you had what was a fairly close referendum on Brexit, and much of the politics after the fact is centered around, all right, to what degree how do we interpret this? Some people said, okay, the referendum was, let's leave the European Union, so let's leave completely, cut off all ties, and just try to be as independent as possible. That's a very strong reading there of what is basically a limited mandate. If it's a pretty limited margin of victory, it probably behooves you to take a more narrow view of it. So there was a lot of people who wanted to stay in the European Union, so given that the result was narrow, it would probably be more conducive to political tranquility to have something more like a soft Brexit, where there are still ties to the European Union of some sort or another. But again, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder how you read a referendum like that. And some people will try to take a referendum result and run with it, and try to take as much as they can with it in terms of changing policy, and other people will be more reluctant. And in a close referendum, I just about guarantee you, people will be pissed no matter what you do. It's just, a close referendum is basically tells you nothing, except that the public doesn't know what it wants, but will hate you no matter what you do. And in that case, a Swiss style of referendums is not going to help you. If your country has a lot of partisanship, a referendum is not going to solve that. It'll just give you a nice way to kind of manifest that and piss people off even more. The key thing to having a system like that encourages more that it extends more decision-making power to the public through more democracy or through more referendums. The key there is having a body politic that is politically and culturally amenable to it. If you have a society where people accept that there are limits to what government can and should do, even if it's otherwise legal, if there are informal democratic norms that are recognized by the broader part of your voting public, in that case, it's more doable to include the public in decision-making. But if your political culture is deteriorating and there's a lot of partisanship and people are jockeying for power, trying to impose their preferences on other people, in that kind of situation, it's a really bad idea. Because then a referendum or whatever other kind of democratizing tool you're trying to implement, that's just going to turn into another political bludgeon that one political group or another tries to use against their opponents. Now, decentralization and contrast works almost regardless. Because almost invariably, the lower the level that you're dealing with, for example, at the level of a village or a town or even a city, the politics are always more homogenous at that lower level than they are at the national level or at a larger level. And because they're more homogenous, it's a lot easier to reach political consensus that's needed to deal with a given political problem. And with decentralization, more political problems are dealt with at a lower level in that vein, such that overall there's less contention and problems are easier to deal with. So in that sense, decentralization has a big edge. You know, the downside to decentralization is that sometimes people take it as an excuse to abuse power at a lower level in a way that creates tension. So the example there is like sanctuary cities at the US. Nominally, enforcing immigration law is a federal responsibility, and it's one that lower levels of government should not really infringe on, even if they technically can. That's kind of a democratic norm. But if there's sufficient political tension in a country, it may be that lower levels of government feel that they are ethically or morally obligated to take action in that vein, in the way that they're kind of stepping on the toes of federal power. Tension like that is almost invariably a result of partisanship and tense politics of one kind or another. So in a case like that, decentralization comes with a cost. It's still kind of manageable now here in the United States, because that's very much a thing here. But if it would be possible for it to reach a point where it really was a crisis of some kind, basically a constitutional crisis. But for now, everybody is sufficiently operating within the bounds of the law that it's not at a crisis level yet. It's still very much doable. But roughly, that's the cost and benefit of decentralization, and also the cost and benefit of a kind of Swiss-style expansion, democratization, if you will, of decision-making power. I guess I didn't talk much about the benefits of that latter. The benefits of democratizing decision-making is that the decision-making process is more inclusive. And nominally, people feel more included and less like they're being ruled over by political elites. You know, they have more of a chance to voice their views and negotiate more with other people, such that they could reach a compromise. Again, perfectly workable if you have a political culture that is amenable to that. If you don't, it's just going to blow up in your face, and it's going to be really ugly. It really comes down to the people, and if you don't have a political culture amenable to it, and you want to have one, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is grassroots political activism. You just have to go out and proselytize and try to create a consensus amongst the broader politic. Inform them, educate them, convince them, maybe have some kind of trade-off where you kind of give up something in exchange for their cooperation on some other political issue. Basically, you just do the normal grassroots political stuff such that you can eventually inculcate more healthy political views amongst the broader politic, such that the overall political culture improves and you can have a system where you democratize decision-making. If that sounds like a very difficult long-term process, it's because it is. It's a very difficult long-term process, but you'll get much better long-term results if you do that. So then, I'm sorry if that question was a little bit meandering all over the place. I hope I kind of covered all the bases, and hopefully not too confusing. If so, let me know, and I can take another crack at it. Let's see, the next question was, what is the Trump administration doing about the threat of climate change? I can just about guarantee they're doing nothing.
I thought it was part of the platform to do nothing.
Yeah, that's the thing. They're not like a climate change government, for sure. In so much as the Trump administration is doing anything about climate change, I suspect it's a legacy policy that kind of held over from previous administrations. And it may be that they can't do anything about it because it's some kind of legislated responsibility. But they've definitely walked back on environmental regulations. Obviously, they very famously left the Paris Climate Accord, which I still maintain was not that meaningful, but it was symbolic, and it kind of gives you an idea of their position on the issue. Yeah, they're not really taking a lot of action on that count. So I don't think they're really doing anything too serious about it. I don't follow climate politics that much, so I could be wrong on that. But I haven't heard anything anyway. It hasn't come up. What has come up is a lot of people complaining about the stuff they've done that's watered down environmental regulations in one way or another. So that kind of leads me to suspect that, yeah, no, it's definitely not a priority for them.
Well, the fun thing about that as a priority is it's between some people who think that climate change is the biggest obstacle that humanity has faced thus far versus other people who say that it's not even an issue and it doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
So we're still in the frontier of deciding whether or not it exists as a country rather than how high up is this on the priority list.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if something does not exist, you wouldn't put it on your list.
Yeah. Yeah, American policy on climate change tends to whipsaw wildly from one administration to the next, depending on their policy orientation. In that vein, is it a thing or is it not? There are conservative administrations that have taken action on the environment, but generally the crux of it was not climate change. It was more just generic pro-environmental, or perhaps more accurately, what would you call it? Conservationist. That's sort of the conservative equivalent to environmentalism, conservationism. So generally conservative administrations have adopted environmentally friendly policies of one sort or another, but generally they're more in the conservationist vein rather than the environmentalist vein. But I don't think the Trump administration is even really doing that. I think they're very much more focused on the zeitgeist of deregulation and reducing the role of government in regulating the economy. So that seems to be more the prism through which they see climate policy, if at all.
I have a lot of climate change deniers in my family.
That doesn't surprise me. I've heard about them. So yeah, that kind of fits.
It's very much connected to the us versus them of the liberal media says this, which is basically whatever I'm about to say you can dismiss out of hand because of who said it. It's a sports game.
Yeah, I was about to say that's very much that American partisan sports mentality of politics. That has unfortunately come to increasingly define political interaction here. To be fair, there are issues with climate science that do leave it somewhat vulnerable to criticism, so it's not as though they're perfect angels. It's a relatively new science, so there's issues that pop up now and again. And, climate science activists don't really do themselves any favors on that count by making wild, bombastic claims about how the Earth is going to fry and everybody's going to die and this kind of thing. So, I mean, I can understand the approach. That's a pretty standard what would you call it? Policy advocacy approach to try to exacerbate a problem and then try to advocate for a given set of policy solutions. But it hasn't done them any favors in terms of climate science. It kind of seems to be more backfiring there. So,
well, one of the fundamental issues here is both the problem itself and the understanding of the problem are directly against what our human intuition has evolved to assess, which is issues that affect the organism over its lifespan and maybe its children. Whereas climate change is like, this is going to be a centuries and thousands of years, millennia-long issue, and it's kind of increasing, but for an average citizen, maybe the temperature goes up a couple degrees. The first, really salient emotional thing that comes to mind when I talk about climate change is the Great Barrier Reef. That was the thing that I remember when we were in school, we learned about, wow, this is the biggest reef in the world. There's so much diversity of life in this reef. It's amazing. Look at the colors. Look at the fish and the coral. All this. And now it's fucking dead. It's super dead. They've talked about, can we fix it? Can we revive it? It's never going to be the same. Maybe there's another reef that's going to show up at some point, but the temperature just isn't right. So that's one example. And people tend to do better with emotional examples rather than statistical data. People just fall asleep They just fall straight to sleep when you're talking about year to year. We've looked at these average temperatures for these areas, blah, blah, blah. They fall asleep. They don't care. They want an amazing story with a hero and a villain, and there needs to be a movie trailer. We need to speak in terms that primates understand.
Yeah, I would agree. You know that, but it's just you have to balance that out, because if the science does have holes in it, then you can bet rivals and critics are going to go to town on it, blow it out of proportion. So it kind of behooves you to be at least a bit cautious in that regard, and it seems like there's not quite enough in that vein. Mm-hmm. We'll see, because it's still ongoing. It's policy advocacy is a constantly evolving process. You adapt as the challenges come. So we'll see if the climate science lobby can kind of work around that. But for now, it's not going so great for them. It's very much, there's very much a lot of opposition on that count. Let's see. Please share your thoughts on. Please share your thoughts regarding EU politics / migrant crisis. Let's see, that's a kind of a broad, sweeping question. Let's see. EU. So I'm going to narrow that down. I'm going to assume they mean European Union migrant politics, specifically EU politics as they relate to the migration issue. Yeah, that ties into an overarching policy question in the European Union about the direction of the European Union. So is the European Union inevitably, or more accurately, should the European Union inevitably trend towards a kind of United States of Europe? Should they trend towards a federal centralized system of that sort? Or should it kind of stagnate, kind of more or less remain the same as a sort of decentralized group of sovereign states that sort of cooperated in certain areas voluntarily? Or should it actually decentralize further and become more like a sort of loose alliance of independent states? And the migrant issue really brought that question out, because one of the questions that came about as a result of the migrant issue was, how does Europe respond? And I use Europe specifically because the question was, how do we collectively as Europeans respond to this issue? And they could not reach an agreement on a collective response. And so the response ended up being very ad hoc, and it was very much defined by individual nations deciding for themselves. So Germany, independent of the European Union, just by itself decided to kind of open its doors and invite a bunch of Europeans, a bunch of people from outside the European Union into Germany. That was a unilateral move outside the framework of the European Union. And then, of course, the equivalent among opponents was Hungary and not Serbia, because they weren't a member yet, but Hungary and Slovakia and Austria kind of erecting fences along their borders and reinstating checks on their borders, kind of in abridgment of the Schengen Agreement. I think even France ended up doing that on its border with Italy. So basically, and of course, Italy and Greece had tried to adapt to their own policies to try to deal with the problem. But the point is, these were all unilateral solutions on the part of these states. There really was not a collective response. The only collective response that was managed was a European Union Commission mandate that migrants be distributed among European Union member states, rather than concentrated in Italy and Greece, where they were first landing. And we talked a bit about the Dublin regulation and its implications the last time. Basically, if you're a refugee or a migrant, you have to be processed in the first European state you land in. But because they're all landing in Italy and Greece first, Italy and Greece face a huge disproportionate burden in having to process and house these people, and they wanted help. That was not forthcoming because, the European Union migrant quota system, where every member state had a quota of migrants they were supposed to take in to alleviate the pressure on Italy and Greece, a lot of states were really opposed to that because they did not want migrants of any kind. They resisted that. And they resented the idea that the European Union would even have the power to force them to take a migrant quota. And so that turned into a big shitstorm that ended up in the European Court of Justice, you know, about whether or not the European Commission has the power to do that. And if it does have the power to do that, what could states do to fight it? And if they don't have any power to fight it, what was the consequence if they just ignore it outright? Which is basically what's happened, which just kind of shows how weak the European Union is as an institution, that member states can kind of just outright ignore its edict. So that's kind of the situation in Eastern Europe now. Places like Hungary and Poland in particular have basically taken to fighting the European Union every step of the way on the migrant issue, specifically the migrant quota issue. And they've taken to, basically I suspect that if the European Union really tried to punish them, they'd just ignore them. Because for them, sovereignty is very important. You know, a lot of these Eastern European countries have long experience with being dominated by a foreign power, if only during the Cold War, if not before that. So they tend to be very sensitive about sovereignty issues, and if push came to shove, they would probably just ignore the European Union outright, because it is that important to them. And I don't think that the pro-immigration forces in Europe are really strong enough or coordinated enough to really kind of push their preference. I suspect that they're going to end up trading that away for concessions in other areas, probably economic. Because migrant issues are not the only political issue in Europe. You know, there's economic issues, there's democratization issues. I mean, there's a lot of issues. So I suspect that the left, if not centrist liberals in Europe, would be eager to trade immigration concessions in exchange for the right and the populist forces in Europe giving concessions on economic issues, which are probably going to be viewed as the more important. That's roughly my reading of the state of immigration politics in Europe. That's a quick summary. There's not a lot of specifics there. You know, if you wanted to get into specifics, you could talk about, you know, Italy getting a new populist government and how the immigration issue fed that government coming to power, and how the immigration issue is kind of what really supercharged populism in Europe. It was already kind of there because of the Eurozone crisis, but really it was the migrant issue that really brought them to the fore and gave them new life. So there's also that angle, you know, about how it's interacting with domestic politics. But in general, if I had to just comment big picture, the migrant issue is kind of ties in more to that overarching question of what kind of European Union do Europeans want? And because the need to respond collectively to the migrant issue kind of forced that question upon the European Union, it's ended up being what's the word I want? Basically impossible. It's become an impossible issue because in order to answer the question of collective response to the migrant crisis, they would have to answer that other question of how centralized they want the European Union to be and what kind of powers they want it to have. And because there's no consensus there, there's no traction there. And so as a result, by extension, there's no traction on resolving the migrant issue. There was nominally, and I think we talked about this, a nominal commitment during a summit recently by individual European states, not even an organ of the European Union, but independent states agreed during a summit that there would be processing centers in Europe, possibly outside of Europe, if they could find a partner nation, where refugees could be housed and processed. But it's not clear if anything will ever actually come of that, since it was just kind of a vague promise and nothing concrete was really worked out. So if we want to get into more details, like the Italy example I gave, and what the consequences of migrant policies and politics are beyond just how Europe is responding to them, this person can kind of ask that, and we can get into it. But I think for now we kind of covered it. That's a rough summary of my impressions. I was curious if you've heard of the new nation of Asgardia, and if you had any. I can't say that I have.
Thor, yeah.
That's the first thing I thought of. I actually just watched that last Thor movie just the other day.
Ragnarok. Sweet.
Yeah. Let's see. So there was a Wikipedia link Let's see, Asgardia, also known as the Space Kingdom of Asgardia, is a group of people who have launched a satellite into Earth orbit. They refer to themselves as Asgardians, and they have given their satellite the name Asgardia 1. They have declared sovereignty over the space occupied by and contained within Asgardia 1. The Asgardians have adopted a constitution, and they intend to access outer space free of the control of existing nations. They are in the process of electing a 150-member parliament, and they are planning to seek recognition as a nation-state. Yeah. Well, those 2 paragraphs I just read are the sum total knowledge I have of this event.
It sounds to me like the people who will allow you to name stars after yourself, where it's too many steps ahead of the curve to actually be territory that's contested.
Yeah, that's the thing. You know, it's one thing to buy a star's name, it's another thing to claim sovereignty. This is one of those things where you'll get away with it as much as an actual state will let you. And it kind of reminds me of that that village in Denmark, what's it called, like Freetown or whatever it was. It was basically a abandoned part of a city where a bunch of, vagrants and homeless people and drug dealers came, and hippies, just kind of people who wanted to live free of authority, and anarchists. They all moved in, and they just kind of took over, and they declared their own state. And nobody outside Denmark has recognized them as a state, but the Danish government has kind of more or less agreed not to send its police there, so long as it's not too much of a problem. So nominally, they have their own sovereign state within Denmark, but nobody actually recognizes it, and if they ever actually caused a problem, the Danish government would just send people in and clear them out, and would be within its rights to technically do so. So it's kind of like that, basically. They can have their own little state in space, they can claim it, they can pretend that it's a state, but if ever an actual state were to have an agreement with another state that demarcates who owns what of space or what have you, or if they just wanted to get rid of them for whatever reason, there would be just about flip all they could do to stop it. And that kind of speaks to the Hobbesian nature of international relations. We've talked a bit about this before, but what makes a state a state? If you declare independence from another country, and you have your own government and you're independent, are you really a state if nobody recognizes you as one? Kind of, but not really, since international recognition is one of the metrics by which you measure statehood. So, I doubt anybody's going to actually recognize Asgardia as an actual country. And without that recognition, they're not going to have any legitimacy.
Well, the condition we've talked about before is the monopoly on violence. And an example that comes to mind is the Islamic State, where they rolled through and they took a ton of territory, and it seemed like, wow, they're big, they've got this area and stuff, but it was uncontested. There wasn't like another big power that was also vying for it. It was a bunch of desert. And yeah, there were people there, but it wasn't like they were fighting against an established nation. It was more of a land grab. And then as soon as the big countries in the regions with conventional military show up, the Islamic State loses ground, loses ground to the point where there's hardly anything left.
Yeah, that's the thing a lot of people don't understand about the Islamic State's initial expansion. There really was not a lot of opposition. Most of their opponents, let me try that again. Most of the opposition folded very quickly. Even if there was opposition, most of the time there wasn't. Because like you said, a lot of that territory, especially in Syria, was either empty or uncontested or just had a few smatterings of rebel groups in them. And of course the Iraqi army famously just kind of collapsed. So it wasn't like a big triumph. They just established a monopoly on violence in places where there just really wasn't anybody taking that share. But in international relations, that not only matters, but also, how can you defend yourself? Like, if somebody can just steamroll you at will without any consequence, that really brings into question your independence. Like, if you have no defenses and just any given country can just shoot your satellite down, for example, what are you going to do? Like, pretty much nothing. And if they shoot your satellite down, and the satellite is basically your country, since they apparently define it as the space inside and around their satellite, then basically your whole country can be destroyed with a single missile without any consequence, again, because nobody recognizes you and you have no alliance with somebody who can defend you. So most likely, nations that actually have interest in space and in governing space will allow them to play their little game. But as soon as it's even a little bit in contravention of any kind of international agreement or even domestic law, it's over. Like, they have no credibility as an independent nation. So it's cute, but this is more like micronations. Have you heard of those?
Nope.
So micronations are these tiny nations that individuals basically go to random spaces around the world and just declare arbitrarily. I think the most famous is a place called Sealand. And basically it's this ocean platform that the British built as an anti-aircraft gun platform in World War II. But then after the war they abandoned it, and then later on in like the 70s or 80s, this random British guy went there and declared his own state. It was his own country, and he called it Sealand. And nobody recognizes it as an independent nation, so it's not really independent. And I suspect the British government would probably still claim that platform as their property, even if not still in their territory. But nobody really cares enough to contest the claim, right? Nobody cares enough to say, no, Sealand is not a country. We're going to send our army and conquer them. Nobody gives a shit. It's just a tiny guy. It's just a tiny little territory contested by an eccentric lunatic. So everybody just kind of lets it slide. There was a similar example where there was this bit of territory that neither the Sudan, that's on the border between, I believe, the Sudan and Egypt. But this strip of territory is not claimed by either the Sudan or Egypt. You know, the border dispute between them is such that both say that this one bit of territory belongs to the other country. But because they both do that, it doesn't really belong to anybody. And it's a very small strip of desert that doesn't really have any value. But this one guy, I think he was European, found out about it. And so he went there and named it out, declared a country named after his daughter. Basically as a kind of a birthday thing. Like, oh, hey, I love you. I named a country after you.
That's so kind.
Yeah,
Thoughtful.
yeah, it's cute. He didn't stick around, though. That's not a part of the world you want to mess around in. It's Sudan and Egypt. And it's not even in, like, the really developed part of Sudan and Egypt. That's, like, desert, rural border region. That's not a great region to be in. So he came, he saw, and then he got the hell out. And that was enough. But that's an example of a microstate, of a micronation, if you will. So there's a couple of those. Nobody takes them seriously. And so this is what this Asgard thing reminds me of. It's basically this. You're going up into space into some sort of kind of gray territory and then trying to make a country. It won't work. I can just about guarantee you it will not last. But so long as they don't step on anybody's toes, it could last for a while. Anyway, those are some thoughts on it. If it's the case that interventionism has decelerated, why has the number of bombs being dropped continued to increase? I'm not sure which, if you're referring to U.S. bombs, I guess that's possible, because there has been an escalation in air support in Afghanistan, if not also in Syria. Increase in the commitment there to supporting, you know, either the SDF in Syria or the Afghan government in Afghanistan. Either of those would probably involve a significant escalation of air support, since the principal form of U.S. military support at this point is air support. So it wouldn't surprise me if there had been an increase in the number of bombs dropped, so to speak, because that would probably just reflect that Trump administration preference for increasing support in conflicts that the Obama administration was kind of trying to walk away from. Kind of looking tough, basically. But then at the same time withdrawing from other hot areas, from other conflict areas. But I don't know. I haven't heard any statistics about the number of bombs dropped over time in aggregate all over the world. so I haven't heard that statistic. If you're talking about just aggregate, not just in the United States, but overall, that's probably mostly Yemen. That's probably mostly Yemen and, let me think. It would almost have to be mostly Yemen, because that's the principal one. There's not very many conflicts around the world where one of the participants has a significant air component. And Yemen is one of the few that does, because the Saudis have come in with air support of their own to back the UN-recognized Yemeni government under General Hadi. I think that's his name. Yeah, it's quite possible to kind of move away from interventionism in general while still having an escalation and, say, an arbitrary metric like bombs dropped. Because the United States is still involved in Afghanistan, still involved in Syria, etc. And if a given administration wants to escalate U.S. involvement, that could easily lead to a spike in a given metric like bombs dropped. And one of the first things the Trump administration did was to send more troops to Afghanistan to try to bolster the Afghan government there, to try to finish the conflict. But that's an example of the conflict that the U.S. is already in. And I would argue Syria is too, in so much as the U.S. is involved in Syria. That's a whole other conversation. But the U.S. isn't really going out of its way to get into new conflicts, which was not the case before. Like the Obama administration got into Libya. That was a whole new intervention. So nominally, at least, the Obama administration, while not wanting to be involved in interventions, kind of got talked into one in Libya, and almost got talked into one on Syria. I guess you could argue they kind of sort of did, but again, that's a convoluted debate, conversation on Syria. But certainly in the case of Libya, that was a whole new intervention the U.S. jumped into. Trump hasn't had a Libya yet, and probably won't. You know, it really seems like he's trying to find excuses to draw down in the Middle East specifically. Maybe not so much Afghanistan. He may be trying to kind of come to some kind of decisive victory there. He's probably not going to happen. Again, that's a whole other conversation as well. But at least in the Middle East, his attitude seems to be just beat the Islamic State and leave. That seems to be the attitude. It's not really clear if that's the plan, because the Trump administration has been nothing if not cagey in terms of its foreign policy priorities, not only with regard to counterterrorism and Middle East policy, just with every foreign policy issue. They've been like that. So it's kind of hard to tell. But in general, yeah, I would still argue that it's decelerating, and that if there is like a metric like total number of bombs dropped, that's not necessarily indicative of greater interventionism on the part of the Trump administration. I guess I should look that up. Number bombs dropped.
Kaboom. We're at a pretty good stopping point for today's stream. I've been on for 9.5 hours now.
Oh, gotcha.
Which is hype. It's good to be back in the rhythm. What time do you normally wake up, out of curiosity?
You know, for the last while, I've been doing pretty good waking up at like 9 a.m., 8, 9 a.m.
Wow. What an economical member of society rising with the sun.
Trust me, I'm the least economical member of society.
Major in economics, aspire to be the least economical citizen around.
Well, there's an argument to be made about the economic incentive as a rational actor towards preservation of energy. I guess you could call that my excuse.
You've got it all figured out. Well, sweet. We got a couple donations. I think there were like two $10 donations. One of them was shouting out you, and then the other one was shouting out you and Fuzzy Cord.
Oh, thank you very much.
But we should be back in the rhythm. I think I went live at around 9. So, yeah, around second half of stream. So doing this segment, if we did it maybe earlier afternoon, kind of like 2 p.m., that would be awesome.
That's fun.
This is a bit of a stretch, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. We had some very entertaining games as well. You're just meandering through this amazing answer of a very complex topic, and someone is just raging at me. You're trash, you're garbage! And they're losing the game at the same time.
Well, that's pretty much the gaming world in a nutshell, isn't it?
It is. It's saltier some days than others. We got a little bit extra today.
A little extra salt.
Yep. Well, thank you, Agent Smith, for coming on. What was this, episode 21 or something? Something
32?
like that. 32? 65?
Sounds about right.
I'll figure it out from the past broadcasts. But thanks a lot, everyone, for your questions. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. Thank you, Agent Smith. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord. We'll see you next week. Keep it real, everybody. Thanks, Agent Smith.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Asgardia. Thank you, Microstates. Thank you, Macrostates. Thank you, everyone who took a third base today. And thank you, everyone who did a 2-base all-in. Without you, I don't even know what we would be doing. Probably something really boring. Awesome. Let's host somebody.